The dust hung thick in the air like a curtain of ochre silk, coating everything in sight with a fine layer of grit. Jackson Wade stood on the wooden platform of the railway station, his weathered hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. At 32, he'd spent half his life driving cattle across the unforgiving plains, sleeping under stars, and waking to coyote songs. His hands, rough as rawhide, fidgeted with the brim of his hat as he waited for the 3:15 from Kansas City. The town of Clearwater sprawled behind him, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the vastness of the Texas frontier. It was 1883, and civilization was slowly creeping westward, bringing with it notions of propriety and order that sat uneasily on men like Jackson. He'd built his ranch 5 miles north of town, a modest spread with good water and grass enough for his herd. All it lacked was a woman's touch, or so everyone kept telling him. "You can't live out there alone forever, Jack, old missus." Harriet had clucked at him just last Sunday after church. A man needs a wife to make a home, someone quiet and dutiful, who knows her place. That conversation had led him here, waiting for a bride he'd never met. The arrangement had been made through his cousin Martha back east, Eleanor Prescott, 23 years old, educated but modest, known for her reserved nature and impeccable needlework, the perfect wife for a cowboy seeking peace after years of rough living. The train whistle pierced the air, and Jackson straightened his shoulders. Black smoke billowed as the iron horse thundered into view, wheels screeching against the rails. His heart hammered harder than it had during his last stampede. Around him, other folks gathered, some meeting loved ones, others collecting shipments. But Jackson's eyes remained fixed on the passenger cars as they groaned to a halt. Steam hissed, and passengers began descending. Businessmen in city suits, a family with squalling children, 2 saloon girls heading for the golden dollar. Then he saw her. She stepped down from the train with a grace that made the rough platform seem like a ballroom floor. Her traveling dress was deep blue, properly buttoned to the throat, her dark hair swept up beneath a modest bonnet. Everything about her appearance spoke of Eastern propriety and feminine delicacy. But when she turned, scanning the crowd, Jackson caught something in her eyes that made him pause. They were green as spring grass after rain, and in them flickered something wild and untamed, like a Mustang that had learned to wear a saddle but never forgotten the taste of freedom. Their eyes met across the platform. She didn't lower her gaze demurely as he'd expected. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him feel stripped bare, evaluated like a horse at auction. Then, surprising him, the corner of her mouth quirked up in what might have been amusement. "Mr. Wade," her voice carried clear above the station's bustle, cultured but with an underlying strength. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Prescott." He approached, removing his hat, suddenly aware of his dusty clothes and the week's worth of trail dirt ground into his boots. "Eleanor," she said simply, extending a gloved hand. Her grip was firmer than he'd anticipated. "I trust you received my letter about the arrangements?" "Yes, ma'am. Reverend Morrison is expecting us." The words felt thick on his tongue. Here he was, discussing his wedding like a business transaction with a woman whose scent of lavender water was already making his head swim. She nodded, then glanced around the shabby frontier town with those penetrating eyes. "It's smaller than I imagined. It's growing." Jackson found himself defending the place. "Got a new school last year, and Doc Henley just built a proper office with a surgery." How progressive. Was that sarcasm in her tone? Before he could decide, she'd turned back to him with a smile that was perfectly appropriate and somehow challenging at the same time. "Shall we collect my trunk? I assume you're eager to complete the formalities." The way she said formalities made his collar feel tight. Jackson signaled to young Tom Brennan to help with the luggage, a single trunk and carpet bag, surprisingly modest for an Eastern lady. As they loaded her belongings onto his wagon, he noticed how she watched everything with those sharp eyes, taking in the saloon across the street, the cowboys lounging outside it, the proper ladies who whispered behind their fans as they passed. The ride to the church was mostly silent. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon seat, back straight as a ramrod, hands folded properly in her lap. But Jackson noticed how her fingers occasionally tightened on each other. The only sign of nerves she showed. "Your cousin Martha spoke highly of you," she said finally as they turned onto Main Street. "Martha's prone to exaggeration." Jackson replied, "I'm just a cowboy with a piece of land and a small herd." "She said you were honest." Eleanor turned to look at him directly. "That matters more than the size of your herd." Something in her directness unsettled him. This wasn't how he'd imagined his bride would be. Where was the shy, downcast Eastern miss who'd need protecting from the harsh realities of frontier life? The wedding was a brief affair. Reverend Morrison, a thin man who sweated despite the cool evening, performed the ceremony in the small church with only Mrs. Morrison and the town clerk as witnesses. Eleanor spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, her eyes never leaving Jackson's face. When it came time for the kiss, she lifted her chin with a grace that was almost defiant, her lips soft but her posture suggesting she was granting permission rather than submitting to tradition. Afterward, they signed the register, Eleanor's handwriting flowing and educated next to Jackson's cramped scrawl, "Mrs." Morrison pressed a bundle of biscuits into Eleanor's hands. "For the journey to your new home." Her eyes sympathetic, as if Eleanor were heading to her doom rather than her wedding bed. The sun was setting as they drove north toward the ranch, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor had been quiet since leaving town, but Jackson could feel her tension like a living thing between them. "It's not much," he said as his ranch came into view. A sturdy log house with a stone chimney, barn, and corrals. "But it's well built and the roof doesn't leak." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, and he was surprised to hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "You built this yourself?" "With some help from neighbors." He pulled the wagon up to the front porch. "Took near 2 years to get it right." As he helped her down from the wagon, her body briefly pressed against his, and he caught that lavender scent again mixed with something else, something wilder, like sage after rain. She stepped away quickly, but not before he felt the strength in her arms, unexpected in such a delicate-looking woman. The house's interior was simple, a main room with a stone fireplace, kitchen area, and a bedroom behind a wooden door. Jackson had tried to clean for her arrival, but now the space seemed impossibly crude for an Eastern lady. "I'll start supper," Eleanor said, already moving toward the kitchen area, removing her gloves with efficient movements. "I assume you have provisions." "Yes, ma'am. Bacon, beans, some cornmeal." He trailed off as she began exploring his supplies with the confidence of someone who knew their way around a kitchen. As she worked, Jackson tended to the horses and completed evening chores, his mind churning. This wasn't how he'd pictured his wedding night. He'd imagined a blushing bride who'd need coaxing and gentleness, someone who'd look to him for guidance. Instead, Eleanor moved through his house like she was claiming territory, each movement deliberate and self-assured. Supper was simple but well-prepared. They ate in relative silence, the weight of what was to come hanging between them like a physical presence. Eleanor's eyes kept finding his across the table, and in them, he saw not fear or resignation, but something that looked almost like anticipation. When the dishes were cleared and the fire banked, they faced each other in the lamplight. The bedroom door stood open behind Eleanor, and Jackson cleared his throat. "I know this is sudden. If you need time to adjust." She stepped closer, and he could see gold flecks in those green eyes. "Mr. Wade Jackson, I believe you've made some assumptions about the kind of woman you married." "Ma'am?" Her hands went to her hair, pulling out pins with practiced ease. Dark waves tumbled over her shoulders, and Jackson's mouth went dry. "You advertised for a quiet wife, someone modest and dutiful." "That's right," he managed. She smiled then, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to breathtaking. But it wasn't a demure smile. It was the smile of a woman who knew secrets, who held cards she hadn't yet played. "Tell me," she said, moving closer until he could feel the heat from her body. What made you think a truly quiet woman would answer an advertisement to marry a stranger and travel 1,000 miles to the frontier? Before he could answer, she placed a hand on his chest, and he felt the touch burn through his shirt. Leaning in, she whispered against his ear, her voice low and full of promise. Cowboy wanted a quiet wife, got a wild one who rode him till dawn. The words sent fire through his veins. As she led him toward the bedroom, her fingers intertwined with his, Jackson Wade realized that everything he thought he knew about his bride, and perhaps about himself, was about to change. The night stretched ahead, full of mystery and possibility, and for the first time in his life, the steady cowboy felt like he was the one being led into uncharted territory. Outside, coyotes howled at the rising moon, their wild songs echoing across the prairie. But inside the little ranch house, a different kind of wildness was about to be unleashed, one that would shake the very foundations of what Jackson thought he wanted from life and love. The morning sun streamed through the bedroom window, finding Jackson Wade already awake but uncommonly still. He lay watching dust motes dance in the golden light, his body pleasantly sore in ways that made him flush to remember. Beside him, Eleanor slept with one arm flung above her head, dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Even in sleep, there was nothing demure about her. She claimed the space like it was her rightful territory. He'd thought to slip out quietly, tend to morning chores before she woke, but when he tried to ease from the bed, her eyes opened immediately, alert and amused. "Running away already, cowboy?" Her voice was husky with sleep but held that same challenging note from the night before. "Cattle need tending," he muttered, reaching for his clothes. She stretched like a cat, shameless and graceful. "Then I'd better get dressed too." "That's not necessary. You should rest. Jackson." She sat up, fixing him with those green eyes. "If I wanted to rest, I'd have married a banker in Philadelphia." An hour later, she emerged from the house transformed. Gone was the proper Eastern dress. Instead, she wore a split riding skirt he hadn't even known she owned, a practical blouse, and boots that had clearly seen use. Her hair was braided back in a single plait. "Where did you—" he began. "I told you that you'd made assumptions." She moved toward the corral where his horses milled. "Which one's mine?" "Yours?" He followed, bemused. "Eleanor, these aren't Eastern riding stable horses. They're half-wild cow ponies." She was already at the fence, studying the animals with a practiced eye. "That bay mare, she's got intelligence in her eyes and good legs." "What's her name?" "Rosalind, but she's spirited, needs a firm hand." Eleanor was already slipping between the fence rails. The horses shifted nervously, but she moved among them with calm confidence, speaking low and steady. Rosalind's ears pricked forward, and within minutes, Eleanor had a hand on the mare's neck. "Saddle?" she asked over her shoulder, wordlessly. Jackson fetched tack from the barn. He watched, fascinated despite himself, as she saddled the mare with movements that spoke of long experience. When she swung up into the saddle, Rosalind danced sideways, testing. Eleanor sat deep, legs steady, hands quiet on the reins. "Well?" she grinned down at him. "Are you coming? Or should I check the herd myself?" They rode out together, Jackson on his reliable gelding. Caesar. He kept expecting Eleanor to struggle, to need help. Instead, she rode like she was born to it, moving with Rosalind's rhythm as they loped across the grassland. When they reached the scattered cattle, she whistled appreciatively. "Good stock. Longhorns crossed with something shorter-horned, some Hereford blood," he admitted. "You know cattle." "My uncle raised horses in Kentucky. I spent summers there." She studied the grazing animals. "Course, he'd have been scandalized to see me actually working with them. That was men's work." "It still is," Jackson said before he could stop himself. Her laugh rang out across the prairie. "According to whom? The same people who think a woman should sit inside doing needlepoint while her man faces all the dangers alone?" They spent the morning checking the herd. Eleanor observing everything with those sharp eyes. When they came across a cow with a festering wound on her flank, she didn't flinch. Screwworm, Jackson diagnosed. Need to treat that before it spreads. What do you use? Carbolic acid. Usually. Have to rope her first. Without warning, Eleanor wheeled Rosalind around and pulled the coiled rope from Jackson's saddle. Before he could protest, she'd built a loop and sent it sailing. It wasn't a perfect throw. The loop caught the cow's horns instead of her neck. But it held. Where the hell did you learn that? The curse slipped out before he remembered he was talking to his wife. Kentucky. She was already taking dallies around the saddle horn as the cow pulled against the rope. Uncle thought it was amusing to teach me. Aunt was horrified. They treated the wound together, Eleanor holding the rope taut while Jackson applied the carbolic acid. When they released the cow, she trotted off, bawling her displeasure. "Your throw needs work," Jackson said as they coiled the rope. "Then teach me." The simple request caught him off guard. In town, women didn't ask to learn men's skills. They kept to their sphere, cooking, sewing, raising children, creating civilization in the wilderness. But Eleanor sat her horse like a queen, chin raised, waiting for his answer. "All right," he heard himself say. They practiced until the sun reached its zenith, Jackson demonstrating the wrist motion, the timing. Eleanor's throws improved rapidly, her natural coordination overcoming inexperience. When she finally dropped a perfect loop over a fence post from 20 feet, her triumphant laugh made something twist in Jackson's chest. Riding back for the noon meal, they passed the Hendricks spread. Mary Hendricks was hanging wash, her 3 children playing in the dust. She stared openly as they approached, her mouth falling open at the sight of Eleanor astride, dressed for work. "Morning, Mary," Jackson called. "Jackson." Mary's voice was stiff. Her eyes raked over Eleanor with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Wade. Please, call me Eleanor." Eleanor's smile was warm, but Jackson caught the steel underneath. "What lovely children you have." "Thank you." Mary's tone could have frosted glass in July. "I'm sure you'll be blessed with your own soon enough. Then you'll have more appropriate things to occupy your time." Eleanor's spine straightened. How fortunate that we all get to define appropriate for ourselves. They rode on, leaving Mary gaping after them. Jackson could already imagine the gossip that would fly through town. By Sunday, everyone would know that Jackson Wade's new bride rode astride like a man and worked cattle like a ranch hand. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. "People will talk. Let them." Eleanor's voice was fierce. "I didn't travel 1,000 miles to live in a cage, even if it's a cage on the prairie." That afternoon, she insisted on learning to mend fences, her soft hands struggling with the wire stretchers until she got the hang of it. When Jackson suggested she'd done enough, she fixed him with a look that could have melted iron. "Would you stop if you were tired?" "That's different." "Why?" He had no good answer. As the week progressed, the divide between them grew more complex. By day, they worked side by side, and Jackson found himself reluctantly impressed by her determination and quick learning. Eleanor threw herself into ranch work with a passion that bordered on desperate, as if she were trying to prove something to the world or to herself. But she also maintained the house with surprising efficiency, producing meals that were simple but satisfying. She could switch from mending harnesses to baking bread without missing a beat, challenging every assumption he'd held about what women could or couldn't do. The nights were their battlefield and sanctuary combined. In the darkness, they came together with a passion that left them both breathless. But it was edged with conflict. She was teaching him that desire could be a two-way trail, that a woman could want as fiercely as a man. It thrilled and unsettled him in equal measure. One evening, Jackson returned from a trip to town with supplies and gossip. He found Eleanor in the corral, working with a young colt, teaching him to accept a halter. "Ran into Reverend Morrison," he said, leaning against the fence. "He asked if you'd be joining the Ladies' Aid Society. They meet Wednesdays to sew clothes for the poor." Eleanor snorted. "I'd rather be shot." "It would help if you made friends with the other women." "Would it?" She turned to face him. the colt's lead rope loose in her hand. "Tell me, Jackson, what kind of friends would they be? The kind who smile to my face while whispering behind their fans about how unnatural I am. Not everyone's like Mary Hendricks. No, some are worse." She turned back to the colt. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not even for your reputation." "Damn it, Eleanor, I'm trying to help you. I don't need help." The words exploded from her. The colt shied, and she immediately softened her voice, soothing the animal. "I need a partner, not a protector." They stared at each other across the dusty corral, the divide between them suddenly feeling wide as the Rio Grande. That night, she didn't come to bed immediately. Jackson lay alone, listening to her moving around the main room. When she finally slipped under the covers, she stayed on her side, the space between them cold and deliberate. "I can't be what they want me to be," she whispered into the darkness. "I've tried. God knows I've tried. But it's like wearing a shoe that doesn't fit. Eventually, it cripples you." Jackson stared at the ceiling, wrestling with emotions he couldn't name. He'd wanted a quiet wife, someone to make his house a home without complications. Instead, he'd gotten Eleanor. Brilliant, wild, impossible Eleanor, who challenged everything he thought he knew. "I know," he said finally. And in that moment, he realized he did know. The very qualities that made the town whisper were the ones that drew him like a moth to flame. "I reckon I knew it the minute you stepped off that train." She rolled toward him then, finding his hand in the darkness. "So where does that leave us?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I figure we'll work it out. Together. Together." She moved into his arms then, and they held each other as the coyotes sang outside and the vast prairie night stretched endlessly around their small sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new gossip, new conflicts between what the world expected and what Eleanor was. But tonight, they had this, an understanding growing between them like a fragile plant in hard soil, needing careful tending to survive. The drought arrived like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. By late June, the grass had turned brittle as old paper, crunching underfoot with every step. The sky stretched endlessly blue, not a cloud in sight, mocking them with its terrible beauty. Jackson stood on his porch, watching the horizon shimmer with heat waves, his jaw tight with worry. "How long since the last rain?" Eleanor asked, joining him with 2 cups of coffee. Even at dawn, the air was already thick and stifling. 6 weeks. He accepted the cup gratefully, though coffee was becoming a luxury they might soon have to forego. Maybe 7. She'd learned to read his moods in their 3 months of marriage, knew the set of his shoulders when trouble was brewing. How bad? Bad. He didn't sugarcoat it. Eleanor deserved truth, not pretty lies. "The creek's down to a trickle. If it dries up completely, we'll haul water from the river," she said firmly. "It's only 5 miles. 5 miles might as well be 50 when you're hauling enough water for 30 head of cattle." They stood in silence, watching the sun rise like a curse over the parched land. Eleanor's hand found his, her fingers work-roughened now, nothing like the soft Eastern lady who'd stepped off the train. "We'll manage," she said. "We always do." But managing became harder as July scorched its way across the calendar. The creek dried to mud, then to cracked earth. Every morning, Jackson and Eleanor would load barrels onto the wagon and make the grinding journey to the river, where other ranchers gathered in grim solidarity. The water level there was dropping too, exposing rocks that hadn't seen sunlight in years. Eleanor worked without complaint, her split skirts soaked with sweat and river water, hauling buckets with the same determination she brought to everything. The other ranchers' wives, when they appeared at all, watched from the shade of their wagons, fans fluttering, disapproval evident in every line of their bodies. "That's man's work," Sarah Morrison declared loudly one morning, her voice carrying clearly to where Eleanor struggled with a particularly heavy barrel. "Then it's fortunate I married a woman who doesn't care about such distinctions," Jackson replied before Eleanor could respond. The words surprised him as much as anyone. When had he started taking pride in his wife's unconventional ways? Eleanor flashed him a smile that made the brutal work momentarily worthwhile. The cattle began to suffer. Each day brought new casualties: cows too weak to reach water, calves that simply lay down and refused to rise. Jackson had to put down 3 animals in a single week, each gunshot echoing across the dying land like an admission of defeat. One evening, he found Eleanor sitting by the empty creek bed, tears cutting channels through the dust on her face. It was the first time he'd seen her cry. "Hey now," he said, settling beside her. "What's this? That calf we lost this morning, she had such beautiful eyes." Eleanor wiped her face angrily, as if tears were a weakness she couldn't afford. "This is harder than I imagined. You could go back east," he said quietly. "No one would blame you. This isn't the life you were raised for." Her head snapped up, eyes blazing through the tears. "Is that what you want, to be rid of your troublesome wife?" "No!" The word came out more forcefully than intended. "No, that's not what I want at all." "Then don't insult me by suggesting I'm too weak for this life." She stood, dusting off her skirts with sharp movements. "I chose this. I chose you. I'll be damned if I'll let a little drought send me running." Despite everything, Jackson found himself chuckling. "A little drought? Eleanor, this is shaping up to be the worst dry spell in a decade. Then we'd better stop wasting time feeling sorry for ourselves and figure out how to survive it." Her fierce practicality sparked something in him. They spent that night planning, mapping out strategies to save as many cattle as possible. Eleanor suggested things he hadn't considered: rotating the herd to preserve what little grass remained, digging deeper wells, even selling some stock early to preserve resources for the rest. "We could sell to Henderson," she said, tapping the pencil against her lips as she studied their figures. "He's been buying up cattle to drive north. Henderson's a crook. He'll offer half what they're worth. Half of something is better than all of nothing." She met his eyes steadily. Pride won't keep the rest of the herd alive. She was right, though it galled him to admit it. The next day, they drove 10 head to Henderson's ranch. The man's smile was oily as he named a price that made Jackson's fists clench. "That's robbery," Jackson growled. "That's business," Henderson replied, picking his teeth with a gold toothpick. "Take it or leave it." Eleanor placed a hand on Jackson's arm before he could tell Henderson exactly where he could put his offer. "We'll take it," she said calmly. "On one condition. You pay in cash, right now." Henderson's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. As he went to fetch the money, Eleanor murmured to Jackson, "He'd have found a way to cheat us if we'd let him pay later." The cash from the sale bought them time, but not much. August arrived with temperatures that made the forge in town seem cool by comparison. The landscape transformed into something from a nightmare. Grass fires sparked by the smallest thing, dust devils dancing across barren fields, the constant smell of death as smaller ranches began losing their entire herds. Eleanor had lost weight, her face gaunt but determined. She never complained, never suggested they give up. But Jackson could see the toll in the way her hands shook sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. One blistering afternoon, they were reinforcing the well when Samuel Garrett rode up. The wealthy rancher sat his horse like a king surveying peasants, his clothes somehow crisp despite the heat. "Wade," he nodded, then let his gaze drift insultingly over Eleanor in her sweat-stained work clothes. "Ma'am, Garrett." Jackson straightened, instantly wary. "What brings you out here?" "Business proposition." Garrett dismounted, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd never hauled his own water. "This drought's got everybody hurting. I'm offering to buy out the smaller spreads before folks lose everything. We're not selling." "You sure about that?" Garrett's smile was sharp. "From what I hear, you're down to 20 head, maybe less, and with a—" His eyes flicked to Eleanor again. "Unconventional wife who insists on playing cowboy. Well, some might say you're not thinking clearly." Eleanor stepped forward before Jackson could respond. "And some might say a man who tries to profit from his neighbor's misfortune is no better than a vulture." Garrett's face darkened. You'd do well to teach your woman proper manners. Wade. My woman doesn't need teaching, Jackson said, moving to stand beside Eleanor. And we're not selling, not to you, not to anyone. We'll see about that. Garrett swung back onto his horse. When you're burying the last of your stock and that pretty wife of yours is begging for water, remember I offered you a way out. As he rode off, Eleanor spat in the dust. Bastard! Eleanor! Jackson was shocked despite himself. What? He is... She turned back to the well, attacking the work with renewed vigor. We'll die on this land before we sell to him. That night, as if nature itself wanted to test her words, the wind began to blow. Not the usual evening breeze, but a howling gale that drove sand and grit through every crack in the house. By morning, they couldn't see 10 feet beyond the porch. The dust storm lasted 3 days. They huddled inside, rags tied over their faces, the cattle bawling miserably in what shelter they could find. When it finally passed, 2 more cows were dead, suffocated by the dust. Standing over the carcasses, Jackson felt something break inside him. Maybe Garrett's right. Maybe we should... No. Eleanor's voice was raw from the dust, but unmovable as bedrock. We're not giving up. Eleanor, be reasonable. We can't fight the weather itself. Then we fight how we respond to it. She grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. You built this place with your own hands. I'll be damned if we hand it over to that carrion crow because things got hard. What if you're wrong? What if we lose everything? Then we lose it together, she said fiercely, fighting every step of the way. That's what we promised, isn't it? Together? Looking at her, dust-covered, exhausted, but unbroken, Jackson felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the quiet, comfortable life he'd imagined when he'd sent for a bride. It was harder, messier, more challenging than anything he'd planned for. It was also more real, more vital, more worth fighting for than he'd ever dreamed possible. Together, he agreed, and pulled her into his arms. That evening, clouds appeared on the horizon, just wisps at first. Then building into towers of gray and purple, the air grew heavy, electric with possibility. Is that? Eleanor breathed, not daring to finish the question. The first drops fell as they were driving the cattle to shelter. Big, fat drops that hit the parched earth and immediately disappeared. Then more, and more, until the sky opened up in a deluge that had them both laughing and crying at once. They stood in the rain, arms outstretched, mouths open to catch the precious water. Eleanor grabbed Jackson and kissed him hard, rain streaming down both their faces. See? She gasped against his lips. We just had to outlast it. The drought wasn't over. One storm couldn't undo months of damage. But as they worked together to channel the water into their wells and collection barrels, Jackson knew they'd survive. Not because the rain had come, but because they'd learned they could endure anything as long as they faced it side by side, later, cleaned up and sitting by the fire. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder. Garrett will be back, she said quietly. This isn't over. I know, Jackson replied, pressing a kiss to her still damp hair. But neither are we. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the world and promising that life, stubborn and irrepressible as the woman in his arms, would find a way to go on. The morning Eleanor told him about the baby. Jackson was mending a bridle in the barn. She appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the October sun, and something in her posture made him set down his work. We need to talk, she said, her voice carrying an odd note he couldn't identify. What's wrong? He was on his feet immediately, concerned. Are you feeling ill? Not exactly. She moved into the barn, her hands clasped in front of her in an uncharacteristic gesture of uncertainty. Jackson, I'm going to have a child. The words hung in the dusty air between them. Jackson felt his knees go weak and sat heavily on a hay bale. A baby. His baby. Their baby. Are you sure? Doc Henley confirmed it yesterday when I rode into town. She watched him carefully, those green eyes searching his face. I'm about 2 months along. The baby should come in the spring. Spring. New life arriving with the new grass and wildflowers. It seemed fitting. Yet Jackson's mind raced with worries. The ranch was barely recovering from the drought. They'd lost nearly half their herd. And while the autumn rains had been kind, money was tight. "This changes things," he said slowly. Eleanor's chin lifted in that familiar gesture of defiance. "Does it?" "Of course it does. You can't keep working cattle in your condition. It's not safe. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Jackson, I'm not made of glass. But you'll need to be careful. No more breaking horses. No more hauling water." "Stop!" She moved closer, her eyes flashing. "Just stop. I won't spend the next 7 months sitting in the house like an invalid." "Eleanor, be reasonable. You have to think of the baby now." "I am thinking of the baby." Her hands moved protectively to her still flat stomach. "What kind of mother would I be if I taught our child to give up who they are the moment life gets complicated?" They stared at each other across the divide that had never fully closed between them. His traditional expectations and her fierce independence clashing like flint and steel. "The women in town already think I'm unnatural," she continued, her voice softer now, but no less determined. "Can you imagine what they'll say when they see me working while expecting? Maybe it's time we worried less about what they think and more about what's safe," Jackson said, surprising himself. Eleanor blinked. "You mean that?" He rubbed his face, feeling older than his years. "I don't know what I mean anymore. All I know is I want you and the baby safe." "We will be," she promised, moving to stand between his knees, taking his rough hands in hers. "I'll be careful, but I won't become a different person because of this." He pulled her close, pressing his face against her middle where their child grew. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "So am I," she whispered into his hair. "But we'll face it together, like always." News of Eleanor's pregnancy spread through Clearwater like wildfire. By Sunday, every pew in the church held someone craning their neck to get a look at her still slim figure. The whispers were audible despite Reverend Morrison's sermon on Christian charity. "Perhaps now she'll settle down," Mary Hendricks murmured to her neighbor, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "A baby changes everything." Sarah Morrison agreed. She'll have to give up this nonsense about working the ranch. Eleanor's hand tightened on Jackson's arm, but she kept her eyes forward, her expression serene. Only he could feel the tension thrumming through her body like a plucked wire. After the service, the women descended on Eleanor with advice and admonitions. She should rest more, eat certain foods, avoid horseback riding, stop wearing those scandalous split skirts. Eleanor smiled and nodded, saying little, but Jackson could see the storm building behind her eyes. The ride home was silent until they were well out of town. Then Eleanor exploded. "A baby changes everything," she mimicked savagely. "As if I don't know that. As if I haven't spent every night for 2 weeks terrified of what this means. Eleanor, they want me to disappear. Jackson, to fold myself up small and quiet and proper until I barely exist at all." Her voice cracked. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm selfish to want more. He pulled Caesar to a stop and reached over to halt Rosalind as well. "Look at me," he said. When she did, he saw tears threatening. "You're the least selfish person I know. You work harder than any 2 men. You saved this ranch during the drought, and you'll be a wonderful mother. Different from what they expect. Maybe, but wonderful." She studied his face. "Do you mean that?" "Every word." The tears spilled over then, and she laughed while crying. "These moods, Doc Henley says they're normal, but I feel half crazy sometimes." "Only half," he teased gently. "That's an improvement." She swatted at him, but she was smiling again. As autumn deepened, Eleanor modified her work, but didn't abandon it. She traded the heaviest chores for tasks she could manage. Mending tack, treating minor injuries, keeping the books, when Jackson found her one morning trying to lift a saddle that suddenly seemed impossibly heavy. Tears of frustration on her face. He wordlessly took it from her. "I hate this," she muttered. I know, but she adapted, as she always did. She designed new split skirts with adjustable waists and commandeered one of Jackson's old shirts when her blouses grew tight. The sight of her, belly rounding with their child but still determined to be useful, filled him with a complicated mix of pride, love, and anxiety. The confrontation with the town's expectations came to a head in early December. Eleanor had ridden into town, side saddle, a concession that clearly galled her, to pick up supplies. Jackson was negotiating with a horse trader when he heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered outside the general store. In the center stood Eleanor, facing down Margaret Garrett, Samuel's wife, a woman who wielded social influence like a weapon. "It's disgraceful," Margaret was saying, her cultured voice carrying clearly. "Parading around in your condition, acting like a common laborer. Have you no shame?" "I have no patience for narrow minds," Eleanor replied, her own voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. "You're setting a terrible example. What will the younger women think? Perhaps they'll think they have choices beyond what small-minded busybodies dictate." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face went purple. "How dare you? How dare you?" Eleanor stepped forward, one hand protective over her belly. "How dare you presume to tell me how to live my life, or carry my child? This baby will be born to a mother who knows her own worth lies in more than her ability to sit quietly and embroider cushions." Jackson pushed through the crowd to reach his wife's side. "Everything all right here?" "Your wife needs a firm hand, Mr. Wade." Margaret spat. "She's making a spectacle of herself." "Only spectacle I see is a bunch of folks with nothing better to do than mind other people's business," Jackson said mildly. He offered Eleanor his arm. "You ready to head home, darling?" Eleanor took his arm, her head high. As they walked to their wagon, she murmured, "Darling, that's new." "Seemed appropriate," he replied, helping her up onto the seat, "given how darling you looked putting that harpy in her place." Her surprised laugh was worth the gossip he knew would follow. The winter months brought new challenges. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed normally, but her frustration at her physical limitations grew daily. She channeled her energy into planning for spring, mapping out expanded gardens, designing improvements to the house, studying breeding records to improve their slowly recovering herd. One evening, Jackson found her at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, calculating figures by lamplight. "What's all this?" "Plans," she said, not looking up. "If we breed Rosalind to Tom Bennett's stallion, the foal should be exceptional, and I figured out how to expand the vegetable garden without taking water from the cattle." He studied her, hair escaping its pins, ink smudge on her cheek, belly round under his old shirt, his wild wife, planning their future with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. "I love you," he said suddenly. She looked up, startled. In 6 months of marriage, neither had said those words. "What?" "I love you," he repeated, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Not despite who you are, because of it." She set down her pen slowly. "Even though I embarrass you in town? Even though I'll never be the quiet wife you wanted?" "Especially because of that." He came around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking her ink-stained hands. "I was a fool. Eleanor, I thought I wanted peace. Turns out what I needed was you." She studied his face for a long moment, then leaned down to kiss him softly. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "Have for months. Was just too stubborn to say at first." He laughed, pulling her as close as her belly would allow. "That sounds about right." That night, as they lay entwined, Eleanor said quietly, "I'm going to keep working after the baby comes. Maybe not as much, maybe differently, but I won't give it up entirely." "I know," Jackson said, stroking her hair. "I wouldn't expect anything else. The town will talk. Let them. We'll raise our child to be strong and independent, like their mother, and steadfast and loyal, like their father," she added. Outside, a winter wind howled, but inside their small house, they were warm and safe and complete. The baby kicked, and they both felt it. marveling at this new life they'd created. "Spring will be here soon," Eleanor said sleepily. Jackson agreed, already half asleep. But he knew she meant more than just the season. Spring would bring their child, new challenges, new joys, and whatever came, they'd face it as they'd learned to face everything, together, compromising when needed but never compromising who they were at heart. The wild woman who'd stepped off that train had taught him that love wasn't about finding someone who fit your expectations. It was about finding someone who challenged them, who made you grow, who rode beside you through drought and plenty alike. And if the good women of Clearwater couldn't understand that, well, as Eleanor would say, that was their loss. The blizzard struck without warning on a moonless February night. Jackson woke to the house shuddering under the assault of wind that screamed like a living thing. Beside him, Eleanor stirred, one hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. "Just wind," he murmured, but even as he spoke, he knew this was different. The temperature was plummeting, and through the window, he could see nothing but a solid wall of white. Eleanor gasped suddenly, her body tensing. "Jackson? Another practice pain?" They'd been coming more frequently. Doc Henley said it was normal. "No." Her voice was tight with controlled panic. "This is different, stronger." Fear shot through him like lightning. The baby wasn't due for another month. He lit the lamp with shaking hands, the light revealing Eleanor's pale face beaded with sweat. "It's too early," she said, gripping his hand as another pain rolled through her. "Maybe it'll pass. Sometimes," but her cry cut him off as she doubled over. "Get Doc Henley," she gasped when she could speak again. Jackson looked at the window, where snow and ice pelted the glass with vicious force. The 5 miles to town might as well have been 500. No horse could make it through this storm. "I can't leave you," he said. "You have to—" "The baby—" "Eleanor." He gripped her shoulders gently. "Look at me. Nobody's going anywhere in this storm. We're going to have to do this ourselves." Terror flashed in her eyes, the first time he'd ever seen her truly afraid. Then, incredibly, she laughed, short and sharp. "Of course we are. Nothing's ever easy with us, is it?" He helped her to the bedroom, his mind racing. He'd delivered calves and foals, but this was Eleanor. This was their child. His hands shook as he gathered what supplies he could think of. Clean sheets, hot water, the whiskey for sterilization, scissors from Eleanor's sewing basket. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of screaming wind and Eleanor's pain. She fought through each contraction with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, but Jackson could see her strength flagging as the night wore on. "Something's wrong," she panted between pains. "It shouldn't take this long." He didn't know enough to argue. All he could do was hold her hand, wipe her face, whisper encouragements that felt hollow against her agony. Dawn came without relief. The storm still raged, and Eleanor was weakening. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified him. "Can't," she whispered after a particularly brutal contraction. "Can't do this much longer." "Yes, you can." He put every ounce of conviction he could muster into his voice. "You're the strongest person I know. You rode into my life and turned everything upside down. You survived drought and gossip and Margaret Garrett's vicious tongue. You can survive this." She managed a weak smile. Sweet talker. But the next contraction brought a scream that would haunt him forever. When it passed, she looked at him with eyes gone glassy with exhaustion and pain. "If something happens, if you have to choose—" "Nothing's going to happen," he said fiercely. "Jackson, listen to me." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "If you have to choose, you save the baby. Promise me." "Eleanor, promise me." "I promise nothing," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You're both going to be fine. You have to be fine. I can't do this without you." She opened her mouth to argue, but another contraction seized her. This time, something changed. Her eyes widened. "I need to push," she gasped. "The baby's coming." What followed was the longest and shortest time of Jackson's life. Eleanor fought with everything she had left, her warrior spirit blazing even as her body trembled with exhaustion. And then, between one heartbeat and the next, their child was there, tiny, perfect, and terrifyingly still. "Why isn't she crying?" Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Jackson, why?" He was already moving on instinct, clearing the baby's mouth, rubbing the tiny back. Nothing. The baby, a girl, he noted distantly, was blue and lifeless in his hands. "No," Eleanor moaned. "No, no, no." Jackson felt something savage rise in his chest. This child was half Eleanor. It had to have her fighting spirit. He turned the baby over, patting more firmly, then harder. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, little one. Your mama didn't go through all this for you to give up now." A tiny cough, then a whimper, then a cry that was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. The baby's color began to pink up, her little fists waving in indignation. "There she is," he breathed, laying the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. "There's our girl." Eleanor was crying and laughing at once, her trembling arms circling their daughter. "She's so small." "She's perfect," Jackson said, covering them both with blankets. "Just like her mother." But even as relief flooded through him, he could see Eleanor was in trouble. She was too pale, shaking too hard, and there was too much blood. Always too much blood. "Cold," she murmured, her eyes starting to drift closed. "Stay with me," he commanded, chafing her hands. "Eleanor, you stay with me. So tired. I don't care. You don't get to leave. You promised we'd face everything together. Remember? Together. Eleanor, that means you have to fight." Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on the baby. "She needs a name." "We'll name her together. After the storm passes. After Doc Henley says you're both fine." He was babbling, desperate to keep her conscious. "Hope," Eleanor whispered. "Her name is Hope, because that's what she is." The storm chose that moment to break. The wind's scream faded to a moan, and watery sunlight began to filter through the windows. Jackson didn't waste a second. He bundled Eleanor and Hope in every blanket he could find and carried them to the wagon. Post-birth exhaustion be damned. The ride to town was a nightmare of snowdrifts and Eleanor's semi-conscious moans, the baby crying weakly against her chest, but they made it. Doc Henley took one look at them and started barking orders, his usual calm cracking. "You did good, son," he told Jackson as they worked to save Eleanor. "Most men would have panicked." "I did panic," Jackson admitted, holding Eleanor's hand while the doctor attended to her. "I just didn't let it stop me." It was 3 days before Eleanor was strong enough to hold a real conversation. 3 days of Jackson haunting her bedside, Hope in a makeshift cradle beside them. When she finally woke fully, her first word was, "Hope?" "Right here," Jackson said, lifting their daughter carefully. "Eating like she's making up for lost time and hollering when she doesn't get her way fast enough. Wonder where she gets that from?" Eleanor's laugh was weak but real. Certainly not from her quiet, mild-mannered father. He settled Hope in her arms, watching them together, his wild wife and their tiny daughter. Both fighters, both survivors. "I thought I was going to lose you," he admitted quietly. "Can't get rid of me that easy. Cowboy?" But her eyes were serious. "I've never been so scared. Jackson, when she wasn't breathing. But she did breathe. And you survived. That's what matters." Eleanor studied their daughter's face, tracing the tiny features with one finger. "She's going to be strong. With you as her mother? No doubt about it. The women in town will expect me to settle down now. Be a proper mother." Jackson snorted. "Since when have you ever done what the women in town expected?" She looked up at him, something vulnerable in her eyes. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if I'm too wild, too unconventional? What if—" He silenced her with a kiss. "You'll be a wonderful mother. Different from what they expect. Maybe, but wonderful." Hope chose that moment to voice her opinion with a lusty wail. Eleanor shifted her to nurse, wincing at the pull on still healing flesh. "I suppose we'll learn together," she said. watching their daughter with wonder. Together, Jackson agreed. Always together. Outside the doctor's house, word had already spread. The wild missus. Wade had nearly died giving birth in a blizzard, saved only by her husband's quick action. The baby was small but healthy. Opinions were divided. Some said it was divine punishment for her unwomanly behavior. Others whispered admiringly about her strength. But in that quiet room, with snow still piled against the windows and their daughter making soft, contented sounds, Jackson and Eleanor had found their own peace. They'd weathered the worst storm of their lives and emerged with their love not just intact, but stronger. "When we get home," Eleanor said drowsily, "I want to teach her to ride, and rope, and stand up for herself." "When we get home," Jackson countered, "I want to build a bigger house, with a proper nursery, and maybe a room for a brother or sister eventually." Eleanor's eyes flew open. "Already planning more? I haven't even recovered from this one?" "Just thinking ahead," he said innocently. "After all, we do everything together. Might as well give Hope a partner in crime." Eleanor's laugh was worth every moment of terror they'd survived. "Ask me again in a year. Cowboy, maybe 2. "I'll ask you in 10 if that's what it takes," he said, meaning it. "I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I," she said, and sealed it with a kiss. Hope slept on, blissfully unaware that she'd been born into a love story as wild and enduring as the frontier itself. But she'd learn, in time. After all, she was her mother's daughter. The riders came at dusk, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. Jackson counted 6 men, all armed, moving with the casual confidence of those who'd grown comfortable taking what wasn't theirs. He'd been expecting them for weeks, ever since word spread that the smaller ranches were recovering from the drought, their herds slowly rebuilding. "Eleanor," he called quietly through the window. "We've got company." She appeared in the doorway, Hope balanced on her hip. At 4 months old, their daughter was thriving, round-cheeked and bright-eyed. Eleanor took one look at the approaching riders and passed the baby to Jackson. "Take her to the root cellar," she said, already moving toward the rifle rack. "Eleanor, we talked about this." Her voice was steady, but he caught the tremor underneath. "If they're here to talk, we talk. If they're here for trouble." The lead rider stopped just outside comfortable shooting range. Jake Morrison. Jackson recognized him from wanted posters. Horse thief, cattle rustler, occasional killer when it suited him. "Evening, folks," Morrison called, his smile visible even in the fading light. "Nice spread you got here." "It's not for sale," Jackson replied, stepping onto the porch. He'd left Hope in her cradle inside, praying she'd stay quiet. "Now, who said anything about buying?" Morrison's men chuckled. "We're more in the business of collecting donations for our charitable cause, which is keeping ourselves in whiskey and ammunition." More laughter. "Here's how it works. Friend, you donate, say, half your herd, and we donate our services in not burning your place to the ground." Jackson felt Eleanor moving inside the house, positioning herself by the window. "And if we decline your generous offer?" Morrison's smile disappeared. "Then things get unpleasant, especially for that pretty wife of yours. Heard she just had a baby. Be a shame if something happened to them." The threat against Eleanor and Hope turned Jackson's blood to ice, then fire. "You'll leave them out of this." "Will we?" Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. "Boys and I have been on the trail a long time. Gets lonely." That's when Eleanor spoke, her voice carrying clear through the window. "Mr. Morrison, I've got a Winchester trained on your head. My husband's got another on your friend there. You might take us, but at least 2 of you won't ride away. Maybe 3. I'm a very good shot." Morrison's head snapped toward her voice. Well, the famous wild wife. Heard about you in town. Ma'am, they say you're unnatural, working like a man. They say a lot of things." Eleanor replied coolly. "They also say I dropped a wolf at 100 yards last winter. Would you like to see if that's true?" The tension stretched tight as fence wire. Then Morrison laughed. "You've got sand, lady. I'll give you that. But there's 6 of us and 2 of you. 3, came a new voice. Tom Bennett emerged from behind the barn, rifle steady. Evening. Jack, saw these fellows heading your way. Thought you might like company. 4. Will Patterson stepped out from the other side, his scattergun prominent. Amazing how sound carries out here. Heard every word about threatening women and children. Morrison's men shifted nervously. The odds had changed, and not in their favor. This isn't over, Morrison snarled. Yes, it is, Jackson said. You're going to turn around and ride out. Don't come back. Don't even think about coming back. For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Morrison wheeled his horse. Let's go, boys. These folks ain't worth the trouble. They watched until the riders disappeared into the darkness. Only then did Jackson's knees threaten to buckle. Thank you, he said to Tom and Will. That's what neighbors do. Tom replied, though I've got to hand it to your wife. Cool as ice with that rifle. Eleanor emerged from the house, still holding the Winchester. They'll be back, she said. Men like that don't give up easy. She was right. 2 nights later, Jackson woke to the smell of smoke. The barn was ablaze, flames already licking at the roof. He and Eleanor worked frantically to save the animals, leading terrified horses and cattle away from the inferno, while hope wailed in the house. By dawn, the barn was gone, along with half their winter feed, but no animals were lost, and the house stood untouched. Could have been worse, Eleanor said, soot-streaked and exhausted. Hope finally quiet in her arms. They're trying to wear us down, Jackson said. Make us scared enough to give them what they want. Eleanor's jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. Then they don't know us very well. The next attack came 3 days later. Cut fence lines, scattered cattle. The day after that, their well was fouled with a dead coyote. Each incident designed to harass, to frighten, to break their spirit. But they'd underestimated Eleanor Wade. I've had enough, she announced one morning, strapping on her pistol. We're going to town. Eleanor, what are you planning? Something these men won't expect. She smiled, but it was sharp as a blade. Women talking to each other. In town, Eleanor went straight to the church, where the Ladies' Aid Society was meeting. The conversation stopped dead when she walked in, dressed in her split skirts, baby on her hip, iron in her spine. Ladies, she said, I need your help. Margaret Garrett sniffed. I hardly think Morrison's gang threatened my baby. Eleanor cut her off. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be any of you, your children, your homes. The women exchanged glances. Mary Hendricks spoke up. What can we do? We're just women. Eleanor's smile was fierce. Exactly what they think. Which is why they won't expect us to fight back. It took persuasion, argument, and finally Eleanor's passionate plea about protecting their families. But by the end of the meeting, she had them. Not all, Margaret Garrett stormed out, but enough. The plan was simple and devastating. The women would take turns watching for the gang, using the pretense of social visits. When Morrison's men were spotted, word would spread faster than wildfire through the female network of the county. More importantly, Eleanor taught them basic shooting and defense, using her own experience as example. You don't have to be Annie Oakley, she told Sarah Morrison, adjusting her grip on a revolver. You just have to make them think twice. Some husbands were outraged. Others, seeing the determination in their wives' eyes, quietly supported the effort. Jackson watched it all with amazement. You're building an army, he said one evening. I'm building a community, Eleanor corrected, cleaning her rifle while Hope played on a blanket. One that protects itself. The test came 2 weeks later. Morrison's gang hit the Hendricks place, expecting easy pickings. Instead, they found Mary Hendricks behind a rifle, her sister-in-law beside her, and 3 other women from neighboring ranches who'd happened to be visiting. The outlaws fled without firing a shot, chased by the laughter of armed women. But Morrison wasn't done. Humiliated, he planned one final strike, not on property this time, but on Eleanor herself. the woman who'd started it all, who'd turned proper ladies into defenders. Jackson was in the far pasture when he heard the shots. He raced back to find Eleanor on the porch, smoking rifle in hand, Hope crying behind her. Morrison lay in the dust of the yard, clutching a bleeding shoulder. 2 of his men were already riding hard for the horizon. "He thought I'd be alone with the baby," Eleanor said, her voice remarkably calm. "Didn't expect me to be ready." Morrison groaned, trying to reach for his fallen pistol. Eleanor kicked it away almost casually. "You're done here," she told him. "You and your men, if I see any of you again, I won't aim for your shoulder." By the time the sheriff arrived, alerted by the network of women, Morrison was trussed like a calf for branding. The story spread like wildfire. Eleanor Wade, the wild wife, had faced down an outlaw gang and won. But that night, after the excitement died down, Jackson found her in Hope's room, rocking their daughter with tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside the chair. "What's this?" "I could have killed him," she whispered. "When he came toward the house, toward Hope, I wanted to kill him." "Jackson, what kind of mother does that make me?" "The kind who protects her child," he said firmly. "The kind any little girl would be proud to have. The women in town stood with you today. You changed something. Eleanor, you showed them they don't have to be victims." She looked at him, eyes still wet. "I was so scared." "I know." He gathered her and Hope into his arms. "But you did it anyway. That's what courage is." Hope stirred, making soft baby sounds. Eleanor kissed her downy head. "I want her to grow up strong, but also kind. How do we teach her both?" "By showing her," Jackson said. "Every day, together." The next Sunday, something remarkable happened. Eleanor walked into church, and instead of whispers and cold shoulders, she received nods of respect, some grudging, some genuine. But respect nonetheless. Mary Hendricks actually moved over to make room in her pew. "Don't let it go to your head," Mary murmured. "You're still too wild by half. Wouldn't want to disappoint you." Eleanor replied, but she was smiling. As Reverend Morrison preached about David and Goliath, Jackson thought about the battles they'd fought and won. Not just against outlaws, but against expectations, against tradition, against their own fears and limitations. Eleanor sat beside him, Hope peaceful in her arms, looking for all the world like any other frontier wife. But he knew better. Beneath that calm exterior beat the heart of a warrior, a woman who'd redefined what it meant to be a wife and mother in the harsh reality of the West. The outlaws were gone, but there would be other challenges. There always were. But they'd face them as they faced everything now, together, united, and stronger for having learned that sometimes the wildest spirits made the fiercest protectors. The change in Clearwater's attitude toward Eleanor had been gradual as spring snow melting into the earth. By the time Hope reached her first birthday, even Margaret Garrett had been forced to acknowledge, through gritted teeth, that the Wade woman had backbone. But respect and acceptance were different creatures entirely. Eleanor stood in Patterson's general store. Hope balanced on her hip as she examined bolts of cloth. The baby, true to her breeding, grabbed at everything with chubby fists and imperious demands. "She's got your temperament," Mary Hendricks observed, entering with her own brood. The words might have been an insult 6 months ago. Now they carried a note of wry admiration. "Lord help us all," Eleanor replied, rescuing a ribbon from Hope's determined grasp. "Jackson says she'll be riding before she walks." Speaking of riding, Sarah Morrison joined them, lowering her voice. "Did you hear? There's talk of organizing a proper school with a real teacher from back east." Eleanor's interest sharpened. "When?" "That's the thing. The town council says we can't afford it. Not enough families, not enough money." Sarah's expression soured, though they found funds quick enough for expanding the saloon. That evening, Eleanor broached the subject with Jackson as they sat on the porch, Hope crawling determinedly between them on a blanket. A school would mean everything for her future, Eleanor said, catching Hope before she could eat a particularly interesting bug. We could teach her ourselves, Jackson suggested, though he knew it was a weak argument. Eleanor fixed him with a look. I can teach her to read and figure. You can teach her ranching. But what about history? Geography? Art and music? Since when do ranchers' daughters need art and music? Since when do ranchers' daughters need limits on their dreams? He couldn't argue with that. Eleanor had shattered enough limits to prove their worthlessness. What are you thinking? That familiar light entered her eyes, the one that meant she was planning something that would likely scandalize the town. I'm thinking it's time the women took a more active role in town decisions. The campaign began quietly. Eleanor organized meetings, ostensibly for planning the church bazaar, but actually for discussing the school situation. She discovered allies in unexpected places: the doctor's wife, who wanted better education for her sons; the blacksmith's widow, who offered to donate land her late husband had left her. But when Eleanor suggested they attend the next town council meeting, resistance flared. Women don't attend council meetings, Margaret Garrett declared. It's not done. Then perhaps it's time it was done. Eleanor countered. Our tax money funds that council. Our children need that school. Why shouldn't our voices be heard? Because we're women, someone muttered. Yes, Eleanor said, standing with hope in her arms. We're women. We've faced drought, outlaws, childbirth, and death. We've kept homes running while our men were gone, raised children, built communities. Are we really saying we're not strong enough to speak at a meeting? The silence that followed was heavy with thought. 2 weeks later, 15 women walked into the town council meeting. The 5 men present nearly fell off their chairs. Mayor Thompson, red-faced and sputtering, banged his gavel. Ladies, this is highly irregular. So is denying our children education while funding whiskey, Eleanor said calmly. She'd dressed carefully for this, her most respectable dress, hair properly pinned, hope clean and quiet in her arms, the picture of maternal responsibility. If one ignored the steel in her spine. Mrs. Wade, you don't understand the complexities. Then explain them. She took a seat in the front row, the other women following her lead. We're listening. Oh. What followed was a lesson in politics that left both sides bloodied. The men blustered about budgets and priorities. The women countered with facts Eleanor had gathered: the cost of a teacher's salary, the number of school-aged children, the long-term benefits of education. An educated populace means a prosperous town. Doctor, Henley's wife argued. Women getting ideas means trouble. Garrett grumbled, earning a sharp look from his own wife. The debate raged for 2 hours. Hope, naturally, chose the moment of highest tension to demonstrate her inheritance by standing, her first solo stand, and declaring "no" at the top of her lungs. The room froze. Then Eleanor laughed, hugging her defiant daughter. Well, gentlemen, even the babies are voting. Whether it was Hope's timing or the women's persistence, something shifted. Mayor Thompson, perhaps seeing which way the wind was blowing, called for a vote. The school measure passed, barely. Walking home under the stars, Jackson carrying a sleepy hope. Eleanor was quiet. You did it, he said. We did it, she corrected. All of us. You know there'll be backlash. There always is. She slipped her hand into his. But Hope will have her school. That's what matters. The backlash came in subtle ways. Snide comments about women forgetting their place. Eleanor's egg customers suddenly finding other suppliers. Invitations to social events that mysteriously never arrived. But Eleanor had never needed society's approval. And she didn't start now. She threw herself into preparing for the new teacher's arrival, organizing the schoolhouse, gathering supplies. Hope toddled along beside her, absorbing lessons in determination with every step. One afternoon, Jackson found them in the garden, Eleanor showing Hope how to plant seeds. The toddler's technique mostly involved eating dirt, but her mother patiently redirected her. Ma! Hope declared, offering him a handful of soil. That's Papa, sweetheart, Eleanor corrected, then looked up at Jackson. Though at this rate, her first full sentence will probably be a curse word. Wonder where she'd learn those, Jackson said innocently, remembering Eleanor's colorful vocabulary during the outlaw incident. She threw a clod of dirt at him, laughing when Hope immediately mimicked the action. "See, this is what I mean. We're raising a tiny barbarian." "We're raising a strong woman," Jackson corrected, dodging another dirt projectile. "God help us all." As summer ripened into fall, the schoolhouse took shape. The new teacher, Miss Catherine Walsh from Boston, arrived looking terrified but determined. Eleanor took her under her wing, showing her the realities of frontier life while protecting her from the worst of the gossip. "They say you're corrupting the entire female population," Miss Walsh reported one day, half amused, half concerned. "Good," Eleanor replied, watching Hope chase chickens with single-minded determination. It was due for some corruption. The truth was more complex. Eleanor's wildness had indeed changed things, but not in the way critics claimed. Women still cooked and cleaned and raised children. They still wore dresses and attended church, but now they also spoke up at town meetings. They organized for causes beyond charity bazaars. Some even learned to shoot, just in case. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Jackson watched Eleanor brush her hair, Hope mimicking with her own tiny brush. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming here, marrying me, living this life?" Eleanor set down her brush, considering. "I regret nothing that brought me you and Hope," she said finally. "But ask me if it's been easy. If I don't sometimes wonder what life would have been like if I'd been born able to fit into the mold?" She shrugged. "Then again, fitting in was never really an option for me." "Would you want Hope to fit in?" Eleanor looked at their daughter, who had abandoned hairbrushing in favor of trying to stand on her head. "I want her to have choices, real choices, not just the ones society thinks proper for a woman." "She will," Jackson promised. "We'll make sure of it." That night, as if to prove her parents' point about her nature, Hope escaped her crib and crawled into their bed, planting herself between them with satisfied determination. "We're going to have to build a bigger crib," Jackson muttered, "with higher walls, or accept that our daughter has inherited my dislike of cages." Eleanor countered, cuddling the baby close. "That's what I'm afraid of," Jackson said, but he was smiling in the darkness. Outside, a full moon illuminated the ranch, the rebuilt barn, the thriving garden, the cattle peaceful in their pastures. It was a good life, hard won and harder kept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles between convention and conviction. But tonight, Jackson Wade lay with his wild wife and their wilder daughter, feeling rich beyond measure. He'd wanted a quiet life and got a revolution instead. As Hope babbled sleepily between them, and Eleanor hummed a lullaby that sounded suspiciously like a drinking song, he couldn't imagine wanting anything else. "I love you," he whispered over Hope's head. "I love you too, Cowboy," Eleanor whispered back. "Even if you did saddle yourself with the most troublesome woman in the territory, wouldn't have it any other way," he said, meaning every word. Hope, as if agreeing, flung out her arms and managed to hit both parents in the face. They muffled their laughter, not wanting to wake her fully, and settled in for another night of cramped sleep and perfect contentment. In town, people still whispered about the wild Mrs. Wade, but now, more often than not, the whispers carried a note of grudging respect, even admiration. She'd changed things, shaken up the established order, proved that a woman could be both fierce and feminine, wild and loving, a force of nature and a devoted mother. The revolution was quiet but real, measured in small victories and gradual shifts. And at its heart was a woman who'd arrived seeking adventure and found so much more: love, purpose, and a daughter who promised to carry the torch of independence into the next generation. As sleep finally claimed them all, the last sound was Eleanor's whispered promise to her daughter: "You were born free, little one, and by God, you'll stay that way." 5 years had transformed the Wade Ranch from a modest homestead into a thriving operation. The cattle numbered in the hundreds now. The horses Eleanor bred were sought after 3 counties over, and the vegetable garden had expanded into a small market operation that supplied half of Clearwater. But the greatest transformation stood 4 feet tall in scuffed boots, her mother's green eyes blazing with mischief. "Hope Elizabeth Wade, you come down from that roof this instant!" Eleanor's voice carried across the yard to where her daughter perched on the barn roof, arms spread like wings. "I'm flying, Mama, like the hawks." Jackson emerged from the barn, took one look up, and sighed. How did she even get up there? Same way her mother would have, Eleanor said dryly. Determination and a complete disregard for common sense. Together they coaxed Hope down, Jackson catching her as she jumped the last few feet with absolute trust. The child was a perfect blend of both parents, Jackson's steady temperament when focused on something she loved, Eleanor's wild spirit when faced with any form of restriction. "You could have broken your neck," Eleanor scolded, kneeling to Hope's level. "But I didn't," Hope pointed out with 5-year-old logic. "Papa says you used to ride the wildest horses when you were young." "When I was considerably older than 5, Eleanor said, shooting Jackson a look that promised words later about his storytelling choices. "When can I ride the wild horses?" Hope asked eagerly. "When you can stay on Buttercup for an entire day without falling off," Jackson said, referring to the gentlest mare on the ranch. Hope's face scrunched in disgust. "Buttercup is boring." "Boring is safe," Eleanor said, then caught herself. When had she started sounding like the conservative townswomen she'd once scandalized? "But perhaps we can find you a mount with a bit more spirit, when you're ready." The compromise was pure Eleanor, protective but not stifling, understanding that caging a wild spirit only made it more desperate to break free. That afternoon, they rode out together to check the far pastures, Hope securely seated in front of Jackson on Caesar. The land stretched golden in the autumn light, peaceful and prosperous. They'd survived drought, outlaws, and social censure to build this life. "Remember when you first saw this place?" Jackson asked Eleanor as they paused at the hill overlooking their property. "You said it was perfect." "It was," Eleanor replied, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "It is. Mama, look." Hope pointed to where a golden eagle circled high above. "He's free, just like you, little one," Eleanor murmured. "Just like all of us." They were heading back when they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. Visitors, moving fast. Jackson's hand went automatically to his rifle, old habits dying hard. But as the riders approached, Eleanor laughed. "It's Catherine, Miss Walsh, now Mrs. Catherine Bennett, after marrying Tom 2 years prior, rode up with her husband and a small group of women from town. All wore split skirts and rode astride, a sight that would have caused apoplexy 5 years ago. "We're having our monthly riding club meeting," Catherine called. "Thought we'd stop by and see if you wanted to join us." Eleanor grinned. The riding club had been her idea, born from those defensive lessons during the outlaw troubles. It had evolved into something more, a group of women who met to ride, shoot, and generally scandalize the more conservative elements of society. "Go," Jackson said, already knowing her answer. "Hope and I will start supper." "I want to ride with the ladies," Hope protested. "When you're older," Eleanor promised, dismounting Rosalind to kiss her daughter. "For now, help Papa, and stay off the roof." She rode off with the group, their laughter carrying back on the wind. Jackson watched them go, shaking his head with fond exasperation. His wild wife had found her pack. That evening, after Hope was in bed, her own bed, in her own room, though she still escaped to theirs half the nights, Jackson and Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "Margaret Garrett joined the riding club today," Eleanor reported, still seeming stunned. Apparently, her daughter threatened to run off to Denver if she didn't start allowing her some freedom. "The times are changing," Jackson observed. "We changed them," Eleanor corrected. "All of us who refused to fit into the boxes they tried to stuff us in. Was it worth it? All the fighting, all the judgment?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Ask me that when Hope's grown, when she can choose any path she wants, not just the ones deemed proper for a woman. When she can speak her mind in town meetings, own her own land, make her own decisions. She turned to him, then asked me if fighting for that was worth it. You know she's going to be a handful, Jackson warned. She's already got your stubbornness and your complete inability to back down from a challenge. And your loyalty and strength, Eleanor added. Your way of seeing the best in people, even wild women who ride them till dawn. He laughed, pulling her close. Are you ever going to let me forget I wanted a quiet wife? Never, she said cheerfully. Though I might be persuaded to demonstrate that riding technique again tonight, for old time's sake. Eleanor weighed. He said with a mock scandal. What would the Ladies' Aid Society say? Probably the same thing they say about everything else I do, that I'm a terrible influence. She grinned wickedly. Good thing I've never cared what they think. Later, as they prepared for bed, Eleanor paused by Hope's door, watching their daughter sleep. The little girl had kicked off her covers and lay sprawled like a starfish, completely uninhibited even in sleep. She's going to change the world, Eleanor said softly. Just like her mother, Jackson replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind. We both did that, Eleanor corrected. You gave me the freedom to be myself. Jackson, not many men would have done that. Not many women would have taken it regardless. He pointed out. You'd have been wild with or without my permission. True, she admitted. But having your support made all the difference. They stood there for a moment longer, watching their daughter dream whatever wild dreams filled her head. Then Eleanor tugged him away. Come on, Cowboy. Let me remind you why marrying a wild woman was the best decision you ever made. As they closed their bedroom door, Eleanor paused. You know what Hope asked me today? What? If the story about how we met was true, if I really said what I said on our wedding night. Jackson grinned. What did you tell her? That she'd have to wait until she was older to hear that particular story. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with mischief. Though I might have mentioned that her papa wanted a quiet wife and got something much better instead. Much better. Jackson agreed, pulling her close. And wilder. Cowboy wanted a quiet wife. Eleanor murmured against his lips, completing their private joke that had become a promise, a reminder, a declaration of who they were together. Got a wild one who rode him till dawn, Jackson finished. And every dawn since. The moon rose full over the ranch, silvering the land they'd fought to keep and the life they'd built together. Inside the sturdy house, a family slept, or, in Hope's case, plotted tomorrow's adventures. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities for a little girl to push boundaries just like her mother had. But for now, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes not from silence or stillness, but from being exactly who you're meant to be, with people who love you not despite your wild heart, but because of it. The Wade Ranch stood as testament to what could happen when a cowboy and his wild wife refused to let the world dictate their limits. And in a small bed, dreaming of flying from barn roofs and riding fast horses, the next generation prepared to push those limits even further. The West was still wild. After all, it just wore a split skirt now and answered to the name of Hope. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps on your own adventure? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more stories of frontier romance and untamed spirits. Share your thoughts about Eleanor and Jackson's journey. Did their wild love inspire you? Let's connect and share our love for these tales of the American frontier.